be humble. I think it's sort of a nice character trait. I think it's something that sort of emerged within the discussion last week. It's not that Judaism demands you have to be humble and you have to act a certain way to acquire humility, but it is helpful to note, good character traits are important. We mentioned the idea of are there values and ethics beyond Jewish law and Jewish tradition, beyond halakha. But so be a good person goes without saying. But what are some of the insights that we can glean from Jewish sources? And maybe some insights into how rabbis in various generations looked at the subject, which is very much discussed today. Self is a very popular prefix. Anyone have some self blank? You want to fill in the blank? Self-esteem. What else?
Self-worth.
Self-worth.
Awareness.
Self-deprecating.
Self-deprecating, self-deprecation. Okay. Here, give you some ideas. Acceptance, advancement. Right? The list goes on and on and on. If you go to Webster's dictionary, right, self-betterment, self-centeredness, self-critique, self-delusion, self-denigration, self-dependence, self-development, self-differentiation, self-doubt, self-hatred, self-humiliation. If you go to Webster's dictionary, there are 218 entries that begin with self. So, you could use your imagination. We're often very concerned with ourself. A guy and a girl are out on a date, and for the first 2 hours, he doesn't stop talking. And the subject is himself. Finally, he pauses and he realizes, I've been speaking a long time, now it's your turn. What do you think about me? So, often, looking out for number one is important, but trying to find a way of balancing it, whether for ourselves or the right way to create a healthy self-image in our children, is something that we think a lot about. Those of us who have younger children who bring home art projects, I picked up my daughter today from art club. Anyone else have anyone in art club in kindergarten age or first grade anyway? They make something, and of course you're going, oh, that's so beautiful, while thinking, what the heck is that? You're encountering that equation of how to properly praise while prepare for honesty or honest evaluation. How to be brutally honest with, I want to be an astronaut. Okay, encourage it, but will it actually happen? Or, I want to be an NBA basketball player. How often they say about the bar mitzvah is the age when a young Jewish man recognizes he's more likely to own an NBA sports team than play for one. But it's clearly about balance. We're going to look at some Jewish sources on the issue. But first, let's see some of the statements that are out there when dealing with humility and modesty. Look at page 64 of the text. We have the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, the visiting diplomat. She said, don't be so humble. You're not that great. Okay? And number two, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Right? He's a modest man, but he has so much to be modest about. Cute, but they are opposites. What's sort of the difference between Golda Meir and Winston Churchill? It's sort of the approach and how they use the concept of humble or humility or modesty. For Golda Meir, who is the humble person?
Great person.
A great person. You have to be accomplished. And then you're supposed to be self-deprecating. Accomplish a lot, but don't talk about it. For Churchill, who's the modest or humble person?
One that doesn't have that much.
One who does not have much accomplishment to their name. That person is modest because they don't have it. Arrogance are for those people who earn it. Humility is for those underachievers. Be humble if you have an accomplishment. So let's look at a third quote. That's there also. Right? This is, right, it is right. Early in life, I had to choose between honest arrogance and hypocritical humility. I chose the former, and I see no reason to change. What is right saying about humility, about the trait of humility, being humble?
Saying things that's dishonest.
Is dishonest. Right? If we want to talk about Arrogance is self-awareness of capabilities and achievements. Humility is self-denial in order to feel less special or superior. You're changing the truth. So we encounter this idea of humility having to somehow hide the absolute truth in certain situations. And sort of begs the question, is this a virtue? So should I be humble? If I'm great, I should say so. If I'm saying, well, I'm really not that great, is that lying? I think sort of the answer would seem to be no, because there is a need for humility. So if we look at compatible qualities, humility and truth, we would never think about that it's two opposites like light. We would think we got to find a way, like in all things in life, to compromise, and that compromise is something that requires some discussion. Also along the lines, are truth and humility compatible qualities? In addition to that, is humility useful? Success often depends on being able to be confident. So if I'm supposed to play down my accomplishments, might this potentially lead me to accomplish less? The idea of will it hinder confidence? Look at text number 1. Someone will please read on page 65, Friedrich Nietzsche.
The trodden worm curls up. This testifies to its caution. It thus reduces its chances of being trodden upon again. In the language of morality, humility.
Yeah, humility is a compound. It's not helpful. A humble person is afraid of exploring full potential. So we appreciate the need to be humble. We appreciate, though, that this can lead to an honest confrontation with some other values as well. At the end of the day, we all say be humble and balance it with the self-worth, but if we would break it into its component parts, how could it be analyzed? So we're looking at a couple of different questions. Are humility and honesty mutually exclusive? Or is the humble person almost by definition hedging the truth to some extent? Does humility inhibit one's ability to be assertive and successful? I'm not that great. Well, maybe you'll start actually believing that and won't strive to reach full potential. And what about, what's the usefulness of humility? In line with the way, the last source. What's the usefulness of humility? And let's look at it. We've seen some quotes and some ideas. Let's look at it from a Jewish perspective, from some sources, from some attitudes, and then try to answer the question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
According to this, what's the definition of humility?
So we're going to have to see.
Oh,
What we're looking for, I would say, is based on this introduction, we're going to look at some Jewish sources to try and understand what is the Jewish definition, the spiritual definition of humility. There are fewer than 218 entries for humility in the dictionary, but for now, we'll sort of look at some presentations and see if that can guide us in a understanding of humility that will be effective for our purposes. So what about Judaism's view of humility? So Judaism sees humility as a step to self-improvement in terms of on the way to righteousness. Look at text number 2 from Pirkei Avot. Be very, very humble. Ma'od ma'od hevesh fal ruach. For the expectation of mortal man is but worms. Echoes of Nietzsche. The whole this worm humility words juxtaposition. Why repeat very, very? Why very, very humble for expectation of mortal man is but worms? Why is it twice? So why can't you just be very humble? Stress the importance. Okay. We see that elsewhere. Words repeated to make sure you get the message. We see that often in the Torah. It says, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor." God spoke to Moses, saying. It's sort of, just say God spoke to Moses, but the idea it wants you to pay attention to the command. Any other ideas?
And also, I think it sort of is emphasizing being very, very humble. You have to be great to be very, very humble. Otherwise, it sort of doesn't make sense.
What do you have to be humble about?
Right.
Oh, okay, that was Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
We saw that. So usually when
I think you have to be. What I'm saying is you have to be very accomplished in order to be very, very humble.
Okay. So you really don't have much to be humble about. So you have to accomplish a lot. Only the person who's accomplished is worth being humble. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
No, no, not necessarily. What I'm saying is the reason it's said twice
Mhm.
is to emphasize that it's someone who, has accomplished a
because
lot.
the person who's accomplished a lot has more of a reason not to be humble because they've accomplished a lot. So the person who has the reason to be humble has the biggest temptation not to be humble,
Yeah, it's almost like,
to stress it.
and
Okay,
you don't have to tell someone who has accomplished something not to be humble. They don't, I guess it's,
okay, spoken like a very accomplished person.
To me, you're like nothing compared to Hashem.
Okay,
So-
I think that is definitely going to emerge. In trying to, in approaching a definition, Ruthie asked about the definition for humility, I think that a lot of what we're seeing, and we can go back and analyze the last couple of weeks, if there's God, and God creates us, everything is from God, we're nothing in comparison to the Almighty. So you have that idea as well.
On the spectrum, if you take Hashem, you take worms, you take us, we're right
We're closer-
over-
we're closer
right
to
over,
worms.
and then we're back
Okay.
right up next to that.
So you have reason to be humble even without talking about your accomplishments. Usually when we talk about ethical development, Maimonides talks about what's called the middle of the road, the golden rule. Right? Not to this, not to that, just work in the middle. When it comes to humility, Maimonides says you have to go to the extreme in the opposite of humility based on this Mishnah. The idea that you have to be very shval ruach, one has to be very humble because any bit of arrogance is complicated. In fact, it comes in this week's Torah portion where Jacob is concerned about his encounter with Esav, and he says, when he's praying to God, he says, Katonti mikal hachasadim mikal ha'emet. I'm not undeserving of all of the kindness which you've done for me. He expresses a humble attitude. And if you look at text number 3, a statement of the Talmud, God says regarding a person who's of haughty spirit, he and I cannot dwell together in the world. The haughty individual, God has no patience for the haughty individual. He has zero tolerance for arrogance. Now, this is somewhat surprising when you think about all the other bad things Jews did and God stuck around for. All you have to do is read. You have golden calf, you have the sin of the spies, you got all of the sinning with the Moabite women. There's a lot of bad stuff that Jews have done that God seems to be able to overlook. And for there to be a tradition that God can't handle the arrogant person stands out. And again, it's not necessarily a divine statement that the Jewish people heard in Sinai about this, but there's the rabbinic amplification of God's voice as being worthy of God having said something like this. I can't stand the arrogant person. And the question is, why? Could be because it's it could be because there's something here as to what it means to have the humble person, what it means to be a humble person. Text number 4 has a fairly fundamental text from the Talmud of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is a protagonist in a lot of the Kabbalistic literature. This statement is from the Talmud Bavli. But he talks about all of the things which will help a person rise in levels of ethical development and spiritual refinement. So it begins with Torah, heedfulness, diligence, moral cleanliness, austerity, spiritual purity, holiness, humility, fear of sin, piety. Then you'll get Ruach HaKodesh. God will speak to you. So if anyone's looking for how God speak to them, here's your recipe. You get back to me, let me know how that works out. The end, though, there's a disagreement, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, what's the most important quality? Humility. Humility is what is most important. So it's important, and arrogance is horrible, and God can't handle the arrogant person. And we don't really know yet why God refuses to dwell with the haughty. Is haughtiness truly the worst of all sins, and why is humility created as the ultimate virtue? We haven't yet defined humility. We've spoken about how important, how great it is. So let's move a little bit further into this discussion by noting that before we answer or try to give a spiritual definition for humility, at the same time as we are concerned with humility as a spiritual trait, as a positive trait, at the same time, the Jewish tradition is concerned with misplaced humility. Right? There are statements or sentiments expressed in the Talmud of the need for self-importance, or self-worth, bordering on arrogance. Text number 5 on page 68. Everyone has to say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam. The world was created just for me. Now this isn't necessarily the most humble of statements. It doesn't mean that a person is necessarily crazily arrogant, but it is an interesting statement. We said that God can't handle arrogant people. We said that humility is the most important principle in spiritual refinement. And here we're saying, it's all about me. Furthermore, there's an expression in the Talmud that it was the humility, text 6a, of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas that caused the destruction of our holy temple, the burning of our sanctuary, and our exile from our land. Pretty harsh statements. We're sort of, very much committed to to sort of, we don't really lay blame for the destruction of the temple easily. There are few traditions in the Talmud as to what led to the destruction of the temple. Was it the sinful behavior of the Jewish people? There's another famous reason given, maybe you're familiar with. Baseless hatred, sinat chinam was part of the destruction of the temple. Here we're saying humility. Now this humility theme is actually part of the discussion about the baseless hatred. Talmud, in that section in Gittin, talks about a story that you may be familiar with, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. This is the story of a nobleman who invited someone to a party, but he invited the wrong person, and one was named Kamsa and one was named Bar Kamsa. The invitation was delivered to the wrong person, so the wrong person showed up, and the guy sees him at the party and kicks him out. And the guy's like, please, I'll pay for the whole party, please, please, please. And the guy says, doesn't matter. And that's sort of baseless hatred. But that's the story in the Talmud. The postscript is that this guy is now furious, not at the person who kicked him out, but he's furious because there were rabbis at the party who stood by silently and didn't protest this behavior, that he was being shamed publicly and did nothing. So the Talmud says that he decided to take his revenge on them by getting them into trouble. How did he get them into trouble? He went to the emperor and he said, the Jews are rebelling against you. How are the Jews rebelling against you? They're not going to accept your sacrifice. Temple time sacrifices were brought daily, and non-Jews could commission sacrifices to be brought. And the emperor did it, and the Jews made a big deal when the emperor had a sacrifice because, hey, it's the emperor. They wanted to be in good graces with the emperor. And Kamsa said to him, Bar Kamsa said to him that the Jews are not interested in your sacrifices. And I guarantee, next sacrifice you provide, they'll reject. And that is proof that they're not interested in you anymore. They're rebelling against you. So the emperor said, no, I'll show, let's see. He sends over a sacrifice. And what Bar Kamsa does is he takes a knife and he makes a little slit at the eye of the animal. And the animals had to meet a certain standard of being blemish-free. This was a blemish. And what would happen is that it could not be brought as a sacrifice. So the emperor sends off the animal. The animal's going to have to be rejected because of what Bar Kamsa did, basically to get everybody in trouble. And so the animal makes its way to the temple. They see it's from the emperor. They're like, this is pretty bad because we can't bring the emperor sacrifice. So there's a whole discussion that takes place. And one of the suggestions is let's kill Bar Kamsa. Because this guy's getting us into trouble, let's just eliminate him. You're not supposed to, but he's putting all of us in danger. Let's use our extrajudicial means and just, get rid of him. And so this Rabbi Zechariah get up and said, no, that's not allowed, because then everyone's going to think that anyone who puts a little blemish on a sacrifice it deserves the death penalty. When that's not true. And so then the suggestion is made, well, let's just accept the sacrifice. Come on, it's one bad sacrifice or the Jewish people getting into trouble.
Is something wrong with it?
But Rabbi Zechariah said, no, that's not allowed. People will think you can bring blemish sacrifices. And so they reject the sacrifice. The Roman emperor gets mad. Later sieges Jerusalem, temple destroyed, end of story. And this comment was made that Rabbi Zechariah, because of his humility, because of being too modest, because of his desire not to make waves or to take on additional responsibility, it was his lack of confidence that led to the destruction of the temple. Not really what we would call a glot story. You ever know what glot is? Glot, you hear it often in terms of kosher. It means glot kosher, you think it's like super kosher. It's like on the meal, you get the kosher or the special kosher.
It was me.
But, in this case, if it makes sense, it was me. Glot has to do with the lungs and whether the lungs are perfectly smooth. And if you already ate dinner, I don't want to bring it up. And if you didn't, I don't want to spoil your appetite for later. But glot is being smooth. The story's not really so smooth. Why not? Why do they have to listen to Zechariah? He's one guy, and the believing side of me just accepts the story. The heretical side of me says this is how the rabbis project their guilt over not doing what they should have done and ignoring him, and they blame him. So sort of blaming the victim. In any event, so humility, on the one hand, we have to recognize the world is for us. So there is this idea of recognizing our worth and maybe even magnifying that. The world is created for me, not for you, it's for me. That's not a humble sentiment. As well as the recognition that when not taking a stand, negative consequences can emerge. That's the lesson of the story of Zechariah. So how do we try and synthesize this idea of balancing humility versus arrogance? So text 6b.
Shouldn't those rabbis just step down at that point?
That's a good question. There are a number of holes in the story. So the Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, in text 6b, excessive humility can dissuade us from serving God. Our perceived lowliness might lead us to doubt that our prayer and Torah study stimulate a flow of divine effluence to all the supernal worlds. He's speaking in Kabbalistic language, as would be expected from the founder of the Hasidic movement. That even the angels are nourished because of our Torah study and prayer. If we were to truly believe this, how incredibly great would be the joy and reverence that accompanies our service. This echoes our sage's statement regarding the humility of Rabbi Zechariah, which causes destruction of the temple. When a person thinks, what impact can I have on high? Can a person in my negligible spiritual stature rectify or cause damage in the higher spiritual realms? Am I important enough for my actions to be registered in the heavenly ledgers? He begins to feel that all his actions are inconsequential and proceeds to follow his heart's desires without fear of consequence. But the truth is that by virtue of our good deeds, we literally cleave to God. Our actions have efforts, have impact. We shouldn't think that we don't have answers to difficult questions, that we don't have influence or impact in the realms which we do not understand. This is a sensible statement coming from the founder of the Hasidic movement. Because the founder of the Hasidic movement was pretty much a radical. The Hasidic movement was an attempt to empower the masses that they too have spiritual worth. The Hasidic movement came out of the disappointments of Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi, familiar with Shabtai Tzvi? False Messiah. He claimed to be the Messiah, everyone believed him, and ultimately was proven not to. We're still here, so he clearly was not the Messiah. And people were very much dejected. Some people were clinging to still the hope that he would come back and still be the Messiah. He was not the Messiah. And then 1648, 1649 in Poland, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack leader, led a whole series of pogroms, massacres that killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, 1648, 1649. So you have a very dispirited Jewish community, and the response of the spiritual leaders was, everybody repent, everyone be better, be more observant, and listen to us, we know the right thing to do, you are all simple Jews who know nothing, and that was the relationship and the spiritual status of the time. Here comes Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saying, no, everyone has worth, everyone has value, everyone's spiritual engagement has impact on the highest realms, and on the angels will sing your praises. Sounds pretty good if I'm one of those guys who's being ridden all the time to be better and better. So it makes sense for Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov to be one of those who addresses this issue, trying to encourage people to recognize their self-worth. The idea of recognizing, balancing this sentiment is something to keep in mind. So we have this idea of humility being part of spiritual refinement. We have the idea of recognizing that there is a certain egocentricity which is important, so we don't have misplaced humility. We can't afford the sense of humility to blur our sense of self-worth. So let's see some case studies from individuals some case studies from within the Jewish tradition. All right, so who is a famous humble person?
Moses.
Man Moses was exceedingly humble, more than any person on the face of the earth. True, Moses was a humble person. But there's also, sort of a flip side, that he was the only human who conversed with God face to face. So if we can try and get inside Moshe's head, for a moment, there is a something to be said from Moses' experience, which can give us. You see the learning exercise number 2. What are some episodes of Moses' humility, or what are some episodes of Moses' lack of humility? Yeah.
He was afraid to take on the task.
He was afraid. Not me. Choose someone else. Who am I? I'll choose Aaron. Okay, good. Humility. What about the flip side? Okay, so Okay, so he did take some steps to appearing before Pharaoh. Were you thinking,
He got, he wasn't allowed to go into.
he hit the rock, right, he took some steps, so he did correct. Once was promoted, once wasn't. So Moses, he had an ego. It was buried down deep there. He was the most humble of people, but he also recognized and sometimes acted upon his understanding of who he was. Let's look at another Jewish leader where we might expect a little bit more of a modicum of humility. Someone can please read text 9a on page 72. It's a short one.
With the passing of Rabbi Yehuda, the prince, humility ceased.
Rabbi Yehuda the prince is dead, there is no more humility. Who is this Rabbi Yehuda the prince? So, he actually was one of the greats in Jewish history. He was the one who presented the Mishnah to us. He edited the Mishnah, took all the rabbinic teachings until his time, which was approximately 200 of the Common Era, so about 1,800 years ago. All of the various teachings that had been in existence, he collected the relevant ones and put them in this book called the Mishnah. He was concerned that the Jewish people, as the diaspora deepens and the exile is longer and longer, that they'll need a textbook to remember all of the Jewish traditions. So he put it all in one place. So he had what to be proud of. He was putting together all of Jewish law in one place. He himself also was a humble person, as he stated himself in the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, that I've learned a lot from my teachers, and I've learned even more from my colleagues, and whom have I learned from most of all? My students. It's a pretty humble sentiment. So he's a guy who was humble, and therefore when he passed away, humility was gone. What about 9b? What did Rabbi Yosef respond to the person who said this Mishnah, who taught this Mishnah? Don't say humility has ceased, right? For there is I. You can't say that there's no more humility because I'm still here. Right, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, is humility ceased? No, I'm here. Humble sentiment? Not really. Yes, I am the most humble person in the world. That doesn't really say very much in terms of, with regards to humility. So why is he saying this? I'll share with one of the commentaries on the Talmud what he says. He says it's because he just had to be honest. How can you say there's no more humility if there are humble people like me? He just couldn't countenance this idea that someone would say there's no more humility. It was his honesty. We were talking before, can humility and honesty coexist? That's the explanation. Not very satisfying. How can you say this?
Well, let's say he kept his mouth shut.
That's usually the best course of action. But he did say it. Why is he saying
If
this?
he kept his mouth shut, he would be, maybe doing a sin. Maybe he was compelled to do it.
That the woman, she made me do it. Yeah.
Well, as a teacher, sure, like a couple of thousand years later, you're still talking about it.
Correct. So I think that there's educational value in what he did, even if it broke with maybe how he should have been acting. Remember, we said before that there are these different elements within humility, or balancing humility with self-worth. It was a teachable moment. I think that's a great answer. So, with this, with these various approaches to whether humility is meant to reflect modesty, or whether humility is misplaced because it's untruthful, and with the Jewish tradition sort of two minds to the value of humility, of excessive humility even, and that being recognized as important by Maimonides in the Jewish tradition, as well as the flip side of a person's humility getting that individual or even the entire Jewish people into trouble. Let's try and define the various components of humility. And here we will encounter some of the insights into human characteristics, which I think are discussed to this day by psychologists and those who look into emotional development. What are some of the elements that go into humility? So one is honest self-evaluation, brutal honesty. The only when you explore, first of all, whether or not I should be humble in my accomplishments requires me to take a look at myself. And it is interesting to note that, since it's over here, I'll write it over here. Hebrew, I get nervous because every once in a while I write with this on the smart board. That's a no-no. Hebrew for humility is anava. It shares a shoresh, a root, with the word ani, which means poor person, as well as the word inui, which means affliction. The word inui is where we get this word, the word ta'anit, which means fasting. So there's this element within the concept of anava, of submission, because you have to submit to an evaluation of who you are and what you have or have not accomplished. Someone can please read text number 10 on page 73.
The essence of humility is a person's not attaching any importance to himself for any reason whatsoever. Humility in thought consists of a person's reflecting upon and recognizing as a truth the fact that he does not deserve praise and honor, and certainly he has no right to consider himself superior to his fellows, both because of his natural limitations and because of his accumulated defects.
So we talked about, are humility and honesty mutually exclusive? Well, from Rabbi Luzzatto and this Mesilat Yesharim, the pathways of the righteous, it's a prerequisite. You need to have honesty in order to acquire humility. What about humility inhibiting one's ability to be assertive and successful, based on Luzzatto? It could get in the way. If I have to really be honest with what I can and can't do, it may keep me closer to the ground instead of shooting for the ceiling. Because I have to be honest in order to be humble. So that could be sort of one component as we try to define. Humility, is it honesty? If it's honesty, great, we should be honest with who we are. But if it's real, brutal honesty, that may limit our aspirations. Another component of humility, because if it's only about honesty, well, if it's really only about honesty, then there are some people like me who are really great, have nothing to be humble about. Okay, fine. I'm saying that for shock value. But let's take Moshe. Moses was a great guy. Well, if he's honest about his abilities, why should he ever be humble? So it can't just be about honesty. It has to be, keep in mind that our opinions of ourselves are often formed based on how we relate to others. So for example, arrogance. Why would a person feel arrogant?
Why would you feel arrogant?
Yeah, why would I feel arrogant or superior?
If you've accomplished a lot.
Accomplished a lot. A lot compared to what?
Others.
Usually others. I have more money than he does. I have a better career than he does. I have a nicer car than he does. When there's comparison, then that can lead to arrogance. As with many components of Jewish thought and Jewish studies, Seinfeld has always some relevance. There is the episode with the Mandelbaums. You think you're better than me,
Yeah.
right? It's go time, right? So you think that's where it comes from,
Yeah.
in comparison to other people. If you don't watch Seinfeld, then I'm sorry, you don't. I mentioned before, you realize everything in Seinfeld would be completely obsolete if they had cell phones.
Yeah.
Right? It would not be the same show. But so when arrogance comes from thinking, I'm better than him. So if we avoid thinking about or comparing to other people, that would significantly change how we view our own accomplishments and how we view our own status. Look at text 11:8. Here's an expression about not judging another person until you stood in his place. Right? Don't judge another person until you walk a mile in their shoes. But let's say you did. Right? Let's say you do observe somebody and you do have a sense of who they are and what they're all about. So look at page 7411b. Even if your livelihood requires you to spend the whole day in the market with the other person, you may not judge your transgressing fellow, although you share the same temptation-causing conditions. Right? You're there with the person, and there's a nice stall selling non-kosher food, and they go for it and you don't. And you know that there's kosher options and that person does not avail themselves of those kosher options. So you start thinking, look how holy I am. I have the same, Shake Shack smells really good. Right? That's the best thing about the rules of kosher is that it's not that you're not allowed to eat it, you are allowed to desire it. In fact, the Talmud has the expression, don't think that kosher is about saying, I don't want it, it's not kosher. It's laudable religious behavior to say, I want that, but I can't have it because it's kosher. So that's why sometimes I specifically, if I have a choice to walk on 85th Street and smell from the back, or go right down 86th Street and stop, I'd walk inside, but people see the yam. But, so even if I see the same temptations, no, you can't judge the person. For it's possible that by nature you're not as heated and prone to passion as your fellow. The Yetzer of all people is not alike. So there's a recognition that we can be hardwired differently than other people. So I may have a better job, or a different car, or more money, but that's not necessarily my purpose here. And that's not my... That doesn't speak to my strength, those accomplishments. Humility comes from the realization that I cannot appreciate the other people's true qualities. Even if I am worthy like Moshe, and I have nothing really wrong with me, and I have every reason to be arrogant, there's still a sense of not being able to compare this directly to others. Just because I accomplish X and other people haven't accomplished X, that's not necessarily their mission. Everyone has their own unique characteristics. So when it comes to, honesty is a piece of it, but if we started going back to some of the questions that we've been asking, are humility and honesty mutually exclusive? Honesty is a prerequisite. Brutal honesty, though, can be somewhat limiting. Does humility inhibit one's ability to be assertive and successful? No. If I have a recognition that my lot has given me these situations, these circumstances, and what have I accomplished, just because it's different than yours, or even quote-unquote better, that it's just quote-unquote better, because it's not apples and apples. And then we still have to address a little bit, so what's the usefulness of humility? It's a nice concept, but how does it get applied? It's still something that we have to look at. So there's also, and this is something that a few of you pointed out, Ben, you mentioned it, the idea of recognizing that really everything comes from God. Right? In addition to there being the value of honest self-evaluation and the importance of recognizing my role is different than your role, everything coming from God is also a component, part of the definition of humility. Look at text number 12. Humility is not synonymous with lowliness. It's not a result of natural inferiority and lack of wonderful talents or deeds, nor is it due to one's being on a bad path, heaven forbid. Rather, humility stems from a lack of self-absorption. A humble individual does not consider himself important, despite all the good he may possess. He's not unaware of his own goodness. He knows that he is good and just in every way, good and just in every way, but nevertheless does not consider himself superior and of a higher status because of his achievements and talents. The reason for this is the recognition that he cannot take credit for his attainments. This is the meaning of the verse that when Moses was exceedingly humble, more than any person on the face of the earth. Moses was cognizant of his own qualities, was aware that his lofty spiritual level was unparalleled, but he was still humble. He recognized that all these qualities for which he excelled were given to him from above. Furthermore, he felt that if another were endowed with the same abilities and qualities as he, the other would have equaled his achievements or even surpassed them. It was this thought process that led Moses to be the humblest man of all. There's a recognition that it's all from God. There's the story of God and the scientist. God is sitting in heaven, and the scientist says to him, God, we don't need you anymore. Science has found a way to create life out of nothing. There are these tremendous advances taking place in technology and cloning. In other words, we can now do what you did in the beginning. We can give life. Oh, is that so? Says God. Yes, says the scientist. We can take plain dirt and form it into the likeness that you did, and we can animate it, and we can thus create man. So the scientist bends down to the earth and starts to mold the soil into the shape of a man to show God what can be done. And God said, no, do it without the dirt. Right? We got to start with the building blocks. Whatever we can accomplish ultimately has its origins, has its foundations of what God has done. So whatever we have is His. And this is a general theme. You think back to some of the things we spoke about in terms of work and recognizing that while we work, everything comes from God. That awareness is there. We talked about Shabbos being an expression of faith and everything coming from God, even while we do our best. And we spoke last week with regards to charity. as recognizing that we have to give because it doesn't necessarily all belong to us. God gives it to us on loan. Here too, the idea of recognizing our accomplishments are partially because of what we've done with the material that God has given us. And that is why that theme, people talk about what's the role of God in Judaism. Because you got people, you can do a lot of things without ever focusing on God. But I think that's what, this God awareness, when applied to the different components of Judaism. What does God have to do with keeping kosher? God commanded keeping kosher, but can you keep kosher without thinking about God? You could, but you're lacking something when there's no God awareness into the realm of ritual everyday mitzvot. In Shabbat, there's something lacking if going just through the motions. I mentioned the individual who would make up the 10th, would be the 10th man in the minyan, sit in the back and read the paper because he was an atheist, but he came to synagogue. Great, because it helped us have a minyan. And I'm sure on some level it was good for him because he's performing the mitzvah. But there's something lacking, right? The idea within Judaism having to balance both of those components. Here's a recognition that we have accomplished a lot, but ultimately everything initially comes from God. So this can explain Moshe, and this could also explain Rabbi Yosef. He said, there's no more humility, but what about me? Well, he was stating the fact from a place of awareness that, I'm humble. I have an appropriate awareness that God has given me my gifts. So I recognize I've accomplished a lot, but it's all from God. That's a type of humility. And that type of awareness was what he was expressing. Not just, there is still humility. Look how humble I am, la-di-da. No, it was the idea that I am humble. I have this awareness, this appropriate awareness of I've accomplished something only with God's help. So once again, if we look back at some of the questions, humility and honesty are mutually exclusive. They're not separate realms. It certainly comes together. When it comes to humility inhibiting one's ability to be assertive and successful, no, there is the idea of recognizing what we are accomplishing is our mission, and in comparison to others, there is no comparison because they have a different mission. And a better understanding of why God can't tolerate arrogance. Think about what we said before, that God said, I can't handle the arrogant person. Why not? Because arrogance comes from denying God's contribution to our accomplishments. Being arrogant and saying, it's all me, well, that's partially denying God. Yeah.
So what about the person who's like down on their luck, or who, in comparison to others, isn't doing well, or like, is that a gift from God?
Well, I think that in the abstract, whatever there's this famous story of Rabbi Elie, whatever God does is for the best. That worked for him because it had a happy ending. It doesn't really work for me while I'm caught in the middle of the tragedy or of the misfortune. I think what we are presenting is a construct of looking at it. Take a concrete example. A person is faced with the challenge: do I work on the Sabbath because I need the money, or do I leave it up to? Do I say no, I can't because Shabbos is more important? I'll get fired and everything will be okay. That's a concrete example. What happens then? You have your commitment to faith versus your need for food. Which one's more important?
You're asking me?
You asked the question. So
I feel like that's
I'll give you, in the real world, our own needs come first, but in the conceptual order of things, God's in charge.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of expressed that in the last class, that, when people came over and everyone was working on Shabbos, the Jews, they said, work will come. But I'm just saying more in the, the person who hasn't been successful in life and hasn't been able to hold down a job and hasn't been able to find a spouse. And there are people like that.
Correct.
And so, I don't know, it's like the question of when bad things
Correct.
happen to people, that's
I think that if you boil it down to its component parts, is God in control or are we in control?
right.
Now, I can say God is in control, but I still may decide to work on Shabbos. I still may complain about bad things happening to good people. One of my favorite explanations of that subject, right? That's the classic, the Odyssey, can't be explained. Why do bad things happen to good people? So think about why you're asking that question. Why do bad things happen to good people? So you're asking that question, you're assuming God knows everything. Right? You're assuming that because if God doesn't know everything, that's how bad things happen to good people. God didn't know about it. And you're assuming God is all-powerful. Because if God is not all-powerful, bad things happen to good people because God couldn't stop them from happening to good people. Bad things happening to good people. You're also asking that question and you're assuming God is all good. Because if God is not all good, bad things happen to good people when God's out to get them. So to ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people, you're taking it for granted that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and good. Right? And if that's all true, then how can you be asking the question? That's why it's sort of, you know, the unanswerable question. You know, it's like the third graders in Ramaz were asking about, you know, is there anything that God, Hashem, can't do? So I throw out the question, how about this way? Can God create a stone that's too heavy for God to lift? So that, you know, that was great. That just had a mind in my So when they finally said, so, you know, so can he? So I said, you really can't answer that question. But I would answer the question that can God create a stone that God can't lift? Because you realize, either way, you're in trouble. Because if God can't create the stone, then God's imperfect. If God can't lift the stone, then God's also imperfect. So I said, God can create a stone that's too heavy for God to lift, but then God lifts it. And it's a perpetual cycle of, well, then it's not too heavy, so, you know, that resonated. Yes?
Just a quick question about humility. So, let's say a person in their business, so they can say, I'm the best in the business at XYZ, you know, I'm better than all my competitors at doing it.
That's right. So that would be honest advertising because that's your man. I'm the best at this, and you could write in very small print. That's because the other guy has a different mission than I do.
So that's okay because you're not saying I'm better than you as a person and I'm worth more. You're just saying I do this.
Correct. And I think in the real world it's a little bit. You know, not everyone has this, you know, sophisticated understanding of humility like we do. So you may have to. They may consider you a snob, but you know. But it could happen that way. But with regard to the issue of why God can't handle someone who's arrogant, well, the arrogant person is denying God to some extent. There's a Talmudic expression: anyone who gets angry is like an idol worshiper. Kol hakoes kilu oved avodah zarah. So that we're all idol worshippers. Well, at least I'm an idol worshiper because I get angry all the time. Why? What is being expressed by that Talmudic statement? The idea that someone who gets angry. Why does a person get angry? At the root of anger is a certain amount of arrogance or sense of expectation. How dare you do that to me? Right? I am your superior. I am your father. I am the more experienced one here. How can you do something that upsets me? So anger comes from this self-aggrandizement that is related to arrogance, and that's incompatible with one's belief in God, and that's, as the sages have expressed, so someone who's angry is someone who is on the way towards denying God. So what about, we still have to talk a little bit about the usefulness or the benefits of humility. It's not rocket science, but this is, as with other elements of equilibrium in behavior, it makes you a happier person. But it's interesting to look at the biblical verses in the next couple of sources that invoke what are the benefits of humility. So text number 13 on page 77. The humble shall inherit the earth and delight in abundant peace. The idea that when we talk about the benefits of humility, you can have sort of the element of, you have the enhancement of relationships, right? What does it mean? Well, because you're able to, you don't necessarily get so angry all the time when people do things where they disagree, because you have a healthy appreciation of what is meant for you to accomplish, and okay, they don't have the same appreciation. So there's certainly that element of anava being directly connected to a more appropriate oneg and rov shalom as expressed in Tehillim. Text 14a, v'yasvu anavim v'Hashem simcha. Humility, better appreciation. Humility leads to a greater sense of joy. Why will humility increase happiness? So look at text 14b. And this is a sort of, it is unique that it's expressing this idea that anava, humility, is a healthy place to be. It's something I think that those who study happiness and emotions would appreciate. Happiness results when one receives an unearned and undeserved gift. It does not result when one receives that which he rightfully earns. Therefore, the person who lacks humility and is consumed with feelings of self-importance cannot attain complete joy. For no matter what he possesses, he feels as though he deserves everything. Moreover, for the same reason, should he lack anything, he will be dejected. Only the humble person is completely joyful over that which he possesses, for he feels that he does not deserve it. Moreover, he will not be saddened if he lacks something, inasmuch as he does not feel he is being deprived of something he deserves. Though the humble person is aware of his talents and strengths, he understands he cannot take credit for them, for they are God-given. Furthermore, the humble person feels that had God given these talents and strengths to another, that person might have utilized them more productively. Building upon some of the sources we saw earlier, Rabbi Schneerson is laying on the line that yes, because what you have you'll be happy with because you don't deserve it anyway, because everything belongs to God, so you'll be happier. And that which you don't have, you don't deserve, so you're not going to miss it anyway. It would seem to be words to live by if life was so simple. The discussion, the issue was once raised. So how do you acquire? How can you acquire a perspective like this all the time? So the Hasidim developed something called hisbodedus. Basically, it's the idea of spending a lot of time alone meditating. Right? So if I had 3 or 4 hours a day of quiet alone time, for me, I'd be thinking a lot about these things, and then I'd be a happier person. And I wouldn't have a job or anything like that, but I'd be a happier person. And then, in general, it's just more of a positive attitude that emerges. And you think back to what we saw earlier. There was this 12 steps towards spiritual refinement. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, no, humility is best of all. There is this opportunity, this appreciation for the different components of humility with regards to a healthy dose of honest self-introspection evaluation, along with a recognition of having a unique responsibility that is unlike anyone else's, and recognizing that what we have comes from God are some of the pieces that go into humility. So the spiritual definition of humility is not very different from how we look at humility in the first place. And there's always the tension of being the unav and not the zanav, but looking at these components